That's not what this is about at all. But he would just want to encourage us that he just loves when you sing to him and you pray to him and you connect with him, just as you're doing right now. But of course, he's God, so he's got more always for us if we want it. Am I echoing like an echoing thing? No, is it just in my ear? Excellent. So yeah, we're going to take worship into 3 sections. We're going to look at the story today. Next week, Sally's going to look at the purpose, or the purposes. And the last week, I'm going to look at the journey that worship is actually every time we choose to do it. And it's going to give you a bit of a flavour to the learning stream that's coming up in September. But it's got its own purpose, this sermon series. So don't feel like, oh, I don't need to come to learning stream because I've been in the sermon series, because that's not strictly true. It's the start of a conversation. We felt like God wanted to kind of refresh and renew and talk to us about the culture of our worship, the value of our worship, and just expand our vision of it, really, and our understanding. But while God has been nagging Sally and I for 2.5 years or something to get our act together and do this, the timing of its release is very interesting to me. And I was thinking about how we've been using the analogy of the children of Israel going into the promised land as our kind of parallel to us finding our church and community kind of home, haven't we? Say yes, Hillary, we have. We were listening to all those parallels because there's been many. And it occurred to me while I was thinking about this that the strongest warning that God gave them just before they went in was to worship him alone. And he spoke to them about being his people in the land he was sending them to, not his people in the shiny new land that he's sending them to. The focus was still on him. Deuteronomy 6, Moses tells them in this very famous kind of sending speech, the Lord your God will soon bring you into the land he swore to give you. Nice, easy parallel for us. We are about to enter the land. And then he says something I think is really important for us to hear. He reminds them, this feels like a bit of a word from the Lord for you to test and weigh. He reminds them that this land that we are going into is full of buildings we did not build and things we did not buy. And it's richly stocked, and they're getting it for nothing, or in our case, £1. And the warning is this: when you have eaten your fill of the land, when it's all going rosy, and people are coming, and there's people of all generations, and it's just great, and we go, yes, this is working. Be careful not to forget the Lord. And he was talking about the level of remembering that is the awe and the reverence, that nothing else is more important than our connection with him. That's what he means by do not forget. So this act of worship, which is the stopping of everything else, what we just did right now, we put everything else down, didn't we? And we tried not to think about anything else, and we just worshipped him. That intentional praise and worship and prayer is a big protector for us for this warning. And I think that's why the timing is now, that we come back to think again. Why do we worship the way we worship? Is there more? What does it look like? Am I scared of that? Yes. So we are going to discover it's got purposes and it's got a journey to it. But first I wanted to look at the story of it, because their history in the Bible, the history of the early church, the history of the church, the centuries, is our story too. And I didn't just want to look at the Bible story of worship. I wanted to look at a little bit, and this is a very snapshot look, at the church history of worship. And why do we worship the way we do? It was a huge study. Oh my goodness. Do a word study for worship and praise. It'll take you months. And if you want the kind of full exploration of it and where it took me, then you'd have to come to the learning stream. I'm just going to pitch that sort of regularly. Is that okay? Here's my summary of what the Bible overall showed me in this study. Is there are 2 clear categories of what worship actually does. One is this upward action, something from within us feels like we are raising God up. We're not, but that's what it feels like. We're raising him up. It's words that talk about casting and throwing and shooting our praise towards him. It's up. Be exalted, O God. Hallelujah. You get the picture, don't you? The other one is a lowering action. Something from within us feels like we need to get lower. We are lower. And as a result, actually, then God is higher. So you've got offer to God an acceptable worship with reverence and with awe. It's that he's bigger and I am smaller. That can just be an attitude. When Jesus talked about worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, he used a lowering category word to talk about that kind of worship. And it can also be a physical response. It's not a response that we find very easy to do, but it is in Bible. And, Nehemiah 8 talks, they bowed low and they worshipped the Lord with their faces to the ground. And physical responses happen in both those categories of raising and lowering throughout Scripture. Probably one of the biggest was just the creating of words towards God. For instance, one of the words for praise actually means to tell a story. When Jesus healed the leper and the people saw it, they went and they worshipped the God. And that word for worship just meant to tell the story of what had happened. So words, they shouted those words in praise. That we see that in Luke 19. They clapped their hands. We were doing some of that this morning. Psalm 47 is an example of that. On the subject of hands, they did raise their hands out. You see that in Lamentations 2, for instance, lift up your hands before him as a kind of instruction to the people. But one of the words for praise, actually one of the most common words for praise, had within its meaning this picture of hands physically being extended or held out as part of what that was. And of course, they danced. The way that God instructed the tabernacle and then the temple showed how worship can be expressed through colour and art and craft and smells. It's not something we do here. Don't be shocked if you walk in one day and there's atomizers everywhere. As Andrew calls it, is it not just vaping? I said, no, darling, atomizers are not vaping. But when King David started a centre for musical worship, I wonder if he knew that it would become the main way that we would consider ourselves worshipping or praising God. He received quite specific instructions or training for creating that shift in the culture of their worship. Basically, God taught him about how, as somebody filled with the Spirit, there was a power to his melody that he could create and his words. And what happened was this incredible tabernacle of David as a musical center. And we see that praise and worship through song is multi-purpose. So they use raising songs, they've got magnifying God, making more room for God in your heart so that he actually feels bigger, doesn't he? Do you feel that ever when you're worshiping and the song maybe takes you somewhere where you actually feel God is bigger? And he's not bigger, he's the same, he's just God. But you've made room for him so he feels bigger and you end up saying things like, I will magnify you. But what we also see through song is that they teach the people through the song. They remember their history together. They remember God's promises through song. They have God warning them through song. They reflect and they confess and they process their life through song, and it's all called worship. So let's give you an example. Exodus 15, this isn't a psalm, shockingly enough, because it's in Exodus. Moses, he creates a song that's one of those storytelling category songs. And within a few lines, he's going to shift from raising God, I will sing to the Lord for he is highly exalted, to remembering their history, the horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea, that's them being rescued by God from Egypt, to personal reflection, the Lord is my strength. He is my song. To prophetic statement, he has become my salvation, considered one of the messianic statements. So as we consider what makes a song, a worship, or a praise song, or any action, actually, a worship or praise action, we don't actually have to be too limited. Dispelling the myth that worship's only worship if we are directing our words to God. About God, I should say, and not about us. We should never worship God and talk about ourselves. That's rubbish. That's just not what's shown in the Psalms at all. So we can relax a wee bit about what worship is. Now, David's tabernacle becomes, the songs that come out of it become repeated songs, don't they? And we see Nehemiah, for instance, talking about that give praise and thanks using those songs that David did. But there are also new songs being created, and then those new songs are being repeated. In fact, the history of new songs follows the history of our church right up to today. When Paul talks in Ephesians 5:18 about be filled with the Spirit, interestingly, he says speaking to one another in psalms and hymns. We would say singing, but he makes it clear, spiritual songs, singing and making melody to your heart. He seems to be making a differentiation between pre-written psalms and hymns, things we already know because they've been written. We sing them with our mind, don't we? Because we're reading them, we're remembering them. And then spiritual songs. Why does he give that a separate category? Are they ones that we sing with our spirit to spirit? Are they things we didn't know? 1 Corinthians 14, he also says, I'll sing with my spirit and I'll sing with my mind also. So he experienced worship as both of these things. Both can be making melody in our heart, but different from each other. Now, David talks about a new song, flipping back to David, Psalm 33, and he's not just talking to musicians, he's teaching through his psalm, and he says, sing to God a new song. But then he also later talks about God put a new song in my mouth. So even within that category of just creating something new in the moment, there's a human element. We sing the song, it comes from us to him. And a God element, he puts it in our mouth, gives us the words to sing. A journey from what we know to what only he knows. Pin dropping. It was quite dramatic, wasn't it? Quite like that. Right, bit of history. New Testament era. We've got the earliest church. They are a persecuted people. So what you see is them scattered, hidden away, but growing quickly. And they are meeting together in homes and small places. They are singing and eating and exploring God and learning together and taking communion. And then in the 4th century, you have a Roman empire. You do have a Roman empire. You have a Roman emperor, and he becomes a Christian, basically, and he decides to make Christianity the popular religion. If you're in it, you're somebody. And everything starts to change. It becomes far less about getting to know God and connect with him, and much more about the power and the politics. You see their worship practices change. The separation starts to happen. And even their buildings, because they get lots of funding, because this is the popular religion, loads of funding. So these beautiful buildings start to be made, but the way they're done is the people back here, furniture in the middle that do various things, and the leaders at the back, who are the only people who can do the big stuff, really. So the leaders look good, high up, lots of wisdom, lots of power, but basically there's this comfortable distance that happens because you're going to church for a different agenda, mainly. Most of the people started to just be like, I go here so I look good. So I'm in with the people. Of course, not all bad. There's lots of genuine believers in there, and there's evidence of them, but it's just harder to find them. Now, 1,000 years later, are you still with me? I love that I'm teaching something on history. I failed history so badly at school. I got an E. 1,000 years later, after this church of ours gets really famous, a bit like a film star becoming a drug addict, it needs a Martin Luther-style reformation. But it's like the film star got clean from drugs, but then went on to become a gluten-free vegan. It just goes too far in one direction. It just goes further than it needed to. And all that beautiful color and artistry and smells and sounds and new songs that they had in the tabernacle and the temple and even actually in that church system are now the enemy of the Protestant. Worship, as in the singing of songs and understanding what you were actually singing, becomes much more accessible for the person, but it's very limited and it's very controlled. A bit like that film star's diet. So fast forward through endless internal conflicts, and we now have this pretty diverse collection of worship practices. And even within your type of worship practice that your church is happy with, if things start to get a little bit too out of control, you can whip 1 Corinthians 14:40 out of its context and use it to create some human rules so that everything is being done properly and in order. And if you're like, what? Come to the learning stream, I take that apart and kill it. So around the mid-20th century, I found this quite interesting, actually, for someone who struggles with history. 2 worship movements started, and they actually ended up with a very similar outcome called contemporary praise and worship, but they started for different reasons. One of them started because a man had a revelation that through worship we could enter the presence of God, the more of God. That was how that side started. On the other side, you've got a very traditional, controlled, constricted church who realized they were losing the young generation by the dozen every Sunday. And so they decided we need to do modern music to bridge the gap. And so that was their motive for doing what we would now call contemporary praise and worship. And good on them. It actually worked. Lots of them started coming back. So what we find over the time that this mulls, particularly with the first one I mentioned, was that the worship leader becomes responsible for leading you into the presence of God, into a connection with God, into the more. And if you don't feel it, then there's something wrong with them. And we're really back to the problem that we started way off in the 4th century, where we are creating a little bit of a separation. A middleman is required for me to connect with God in this setting. And I think that's not right. It's not biblical. Remember that our words to God, the new song or the prayer, the new words that you are saying to him, our heart poured out to God in adoration and in processing, that is far more powerful. It's far more valuable to God, actually, than you always using someone else's words. Someone else's words can help you, and I will go into that in the last week. So I am not downing the pre-written song or the pre-written prayer or any of that. Of course not. But your words, your direct conversation with him is far more valuable to him. We don't have to have a middleman, and we should never put one person under that pressure anyway. And what we saw was the worship leader got put on pedestals, didn't they? Literally high up, as high as they could go. Buildings started being built with these great big high up stages for the worship band. Now, I'm not criticizing at all. Well, maybe I am. No, I'm not. I'm not, because actually a lot of these people had a great heart. They just wanted to worship. They just wanted to help. But we put middlemen in place. We're all on the worship team. So, as I come to this bit, I would say in this enormous, great big study I did of our story, our history, the thing that stuck out to me the most is that this is a story of people who want to seek God's face. And then also that God is seeking people who are seeking his face. So we're seeking him, looking up at his face, which is looking down, looking for us to seek him. Do you see this connection? That's a beautiful picture of worship. That's one of the strongest things that stood out to me in all of this. And I wanted to make a little bit of time for a modern day story, and that would be a Kate Aitken story. And while Kate is a worship leader, she's coming up now, right now. While Kate is a worship leader, actually she's been on her own journey as a worshipper. Do you want to come here, darling? On, mute, on. I'm giving you the mic, but I need to tell you that I don't often do that. I'm on. But we're not in America, so we'll be fine. We'll be fine. Yeah. So Kate wanted me to ask her some questions, give her some structure, rather than just handing her a mic. So when did God challenge you about worship, and what did it look like?
So I think maybe about 2 years ago, Hillary had said to me, it'd be good to get some of the worship team together and maybe just have, a night in Union Road where we're just bringing our instruments and we're getting a bit more time together, a bit more space. And I was like, yeah, that would be really good. So we did a couple of nights together where we were kind of bringing our instruments, and there were some artists that came as well. And I think I was like, oh, this feels a little bit different to Sunday morning, and I'm interested in how, I guess, the spaces, that if we allow God the spaces, what he actually initiates, rather than us always singing to him and going through the structures, because I was getting a bit burnt out with the structure of, we do this. So I kind of felt God nudging to go, well, let's explore that, and that might look a little bit different. So yeah, probably when we started to do those nights.
Cool. Oh, I've got a mic, haven't I? And what have been the highlights of that journey since then? So
I think the first night we did it, you had kind of said, I said, so will I prepare a song? Bring a song. And she was like, Hillary was like, well, yeah, just one's fine. And I, in my musician panic, going, one song, and there's going to be everyone there, and what are we going to do? And then you had said, let's just allow God to speak in the spaces. And I was like, spaces? What does that actually look like? But actually, the spaces created, and this is going to sound a little bit off, but the spaces created melodies and songs from people when they just were open to him. And that kind of blew me away, because as a musician, you're like, give me the notes, give me the key, and I can figure it out. So there was one point where, you sort of encouraged us to don't go to the instrument that you normally play. So I play piano, so I was like, okay, I'll just sit and wait on God. And actually I think the act of waiting and going, I'm listening to you and I haven't got an agenda, was quite a big thing. But then God said, play D and A on the piano, and I was like, what? No, because that's 2 notes and that is not a tune, and I'll look silly, and I'll look really silly. No, I'm not going to. And then I was like, well, you need to make a choice. So I did. I got up, and I think Jane was there that night, and I started to play something, and then Jane was on another piano, and she started to play something, and then someone was on a drum, and the thing just took off, and it was a melody like I've never heard, because I wasn't. It was God. And then somebody started singing, and it went, and it went, and it went, and then it came to a stop, and it was like, that was, what was that? But it wasn't weird or contrived, or it was just something that was beautiful. And there was just freedom to go, and now I'm hearing a song, or I'm hearing a word, or I want to declare a word over somebody else. So just the flow of like, God's actually downloading loads, and we're just going, okay. So that was cool.
And I mean, this is your journey, and it's not going to look like anyone else's journey, because we've all got our own thing, and I will talk about that in week 3, and Sally will touch on that too. So this was what he was taking you on. What would be the hardest part of where you've been coming from?
I think for all of us, because I think the hardest thing is the fear of like, taking that step. in front of other people, but also going, well, is this about me and God, or is it about me and other people? So actually just the hardest thing is actually just taking that step, leaning into him and not fearing what he's doing, because he knows us all individually and he knows our journey. And it's not, I'm sure the Bible says like God doesn't give you anything more than you can handle. But I was actually thinking of that verse, God's not given us a spirit of fear. And I think we can fear it and go, I like to control this and I don't. And I just think he's our Father, so it's like, your Father's good, so it's just that, I guess it's that sense of just trusting him and going, I'll take that next step. So I think, that's been the hardest thing, but actually once you did it, it was good.
That's great.
Yeah.
I love it. You've answered my last question, so that was